What I'm going to speak about today is really sort of following the AIDS epidemic, first in the United States. I think I'll probably, given the time, spend most of my talk on the United States, and then also Ron's and my experience doing oral history and the AIDS epidemic in South Africa. The first work that Mary Marshall alluded to, AIDS Doctors, Voices from the Epidemic, began around 1991 or 2. I mean, this is like the dark ages. I don't even remember one year from the next at this point. Ron Baer, who's my co-author and colleague and old friend, was at a meeting at the CDC in Atlanta, which was attended by AIDS doctors. And he's an ethicist and political scientist interested in AIDS. And after the meeting, he went out to dinner with a group of the AIDS doctors. And so it was a bunch of the guys and gals who had been involved in the AIDS epidemic at that point for maybe a dozen years. And they began to trade stories. And these were like war stories about their experiences during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And Ron was sort of a fly on the wall listening to these stories, and he was enthralled. He said, you know, these are wonderful stories, and these are precisely the kinds of tales that will never be published. These people are doctors. If they publish in the medical journals, scientific articles, but these kinds of personal stories are going to be lost. And this was a time before there was a whole school of doctor narratives. At this point, many physicians are trained to write narratives, but at that juncture in the early 1990s, there were very few examples of doctors writing about their experiences with the epidemic. And by and large, when they did, they primarily focused on their patients, their experience with patients, and not really their own emotional and intellectual, psychological experience of the AIDS epidemic. So Ron came back, and he's a political scientist, I'm an historian, and he said, well, what should we do? And we decided we would do this thing called oral history, which we had heard about, and in fact sort of done. We were like the Molière character, Monsieur Jourdain. You know, we didn't know we were speaking prose all along because we had done interviews for previous writing. But we were lucky enough to know of Ron Greeley and Mary Marshall Clark, and we came down and they really spoke to us about the project and introduced us to oral history and the different ways in which oral history could be applied and done. So we decided that we were going to undertake this project, which I have to say was a real labor of love. It was the best research project I think I've ever undertaken. It was absolutely fascinating. But having committed ourselves to the project, we had to decide what we were going to do. Obviously, we were going to interview physicians. That was our choice. How are we going to select these doctors? And we decided that we would call, this is before we knew email, we would call a small group of doctors in New York and LA and San Francisco and Chicago who were different in a number of ways, and asked them to compose a list of physicians that they thought we should interview. We wanted doctors who had committed themselves from the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, wherever they were, and were hands-on treaters, and were still working with patients. Those are the kinds of people we wanted, people who were in the trenches, if you will. And they came up with a list. There were some overlapping names, but about 50 doctors. And we started with those 50 doctors. Of those 50, only two elected not to be interviewed. So clearly there was a great interest on the part of these physicians to be in whatever book we were going to be doing. And we learned from Mary Marshall and Ron that we should tape these interviews, and we should look forward to having these interviews transcribed, things that really are so basic but which we had to learn. Then we had to make a number of decisions. One of our concerns was, as historians, how frank would doctors be, especially in the area of confidentiality. Doctors are like, there's a thin white line, just like there's a thin blue line. Doctors often don't want to speak ill of other physicians outside, to outsiders. And they might not want to talk about administrators and things of that kind, or things they did which may be illegal or immoral. And yet we wanted, at the same time, to give these doctors, we didn't want these doctors to be anonymous. We didn't want to give them false names either. It just didn't make sense to do that. I mean, sociologists and anthropologists sometimes provide fictional names for places or people. But we thought that part of the force of the book would be that you were listening to the voices of identifiable doctors. And in addition, a number of these doctors were extremely well known. People became famous as AIDS doctors. So once you describe the person, people who read the book would know who they were anyway. So what we decided to do was to be frank with the doctors and say, look, we want you to say whatever comes to your mind during these interviews, because the interviews will be transcribed. And then we will allow you to read the transcriptions. And if there are things in the transcriptions that you want to remove, amend, or sequester for X number of years, you're free to do that. So feel free to be frank with us. And I think that they were, in the sense that we have a number of incredible stories. And in fact, at one point, using one of the stories, we had to fictionalize a doctor because she talked about helping a patient to die, which was illegal, and she could have gotten in a lot of trouble. She really allowed that transcript to be to be available. So in using in the book, we hid her. We called her him, and we didn't say where she was and that sort of thing. So the other thing that we did, I think the other next question to deal with during this oral history was essentially preparing ourselves for the interviews. Now let me say a little bit about Ron Baer. Ron is a very famous political scientist and ethicist. He's really identified with the HIV/AIDS epidemic almost from the beginning, and is quite an authority on the ethical issues attendant on the epidemic. And both he and I became involved in various ways with the epidemic very early on, about 1983, 1984. So we had a fairly intimate knowledge of the epidemic. We ourselves had gone through, in various ways, the stages of the epidemic. And at that point, I think, even without research, could have done interviews. But the function of research was not to get research about the epidemic, but really to learn about the physicians. We had a research assistant, and what we tried to do was get every publication, if these doctors had done studies, had published in journals, every mention in the press of these people, so that the research assistant could provide us with a bio of the person we were going to interview. And we read all the scientific articles, and we really felt both emotionally and intellectually prepared for these interviews. And being prepared in that way serves a number of functions. Let me say that of these people, there were some who were quite famous and had been interviewed many times. But interviewed many times by journalists. And journalists often just lob questions at the person, or there are certain cliched questions they ask. What you want to do when you interview, or what I wanted to do when we interviewed these doctors, was have a kind of credibility that went beyond journalism. That when you sat down with them, you could communicate, you could broadcast the fact that you really knew about AIDS, you really knew about them, you knew about their research, you could ask scientific and personal questions which were based on this kind of deep knowledge. And I think that was very helpful in getting them to answer more fully rather than the way in which they would respond to journalists. The other thing you have to ask yourself, as particularly for these doctors who have been interviewed many times, they have stock answers. You may want to ask the same questions, but you don't want the stock answer. And therefore, you really had to think about how you're going to ask that question in a way that was different, that was oblique, that came at it in an original way, or probing them in nicely, so that they would go beyond their rote answers. That was very, very important. What we did to prepare also was to have a questionnaire. Excuse me 1 second while I make sure my phone is off. We had a questionnaire of about 45 questions, which were standard questions that we asked of everybody. And then for each of the doctors, based on that bio and our knowledge of them, we also added questions that were specific to those individuals. And of course, there were certain questions, stock questions, which would be inappropriate for that person, and we would not ask those questions. Now, we knew those questions, but when you go into an interview, the people here done oral history know this, what you're involved in, and I think I'm quoting Ron Greeley when I say this, is a kind of controlled conversation. You're not going to go through the list of questions. You may begin with the same questions, but you want to allow the interview to have its own dynamic, its own flow, which in a way allows you to get much more information and makes you aware of things that you hadn't planned on at all. But by the end of the interview, which on average lasts about 4 hours, these are very intense interviews, you had covered those questions, but not in any particular order. One of the things that was, I think, interesting was the purpose that these questionnaires served. You went in with a structure, which was often useful because while some of these doctors have been interviewed many times, I would say that the majority of the doctors had never been interviewed. They were not famous. They were office-based or hospital doctors. And basically they were composing their autobiography in this interview. And so the questionnaire and the research allowed you to provide the skeleton of this autobiography. Often this was the first time that these doctors had actually spoken to anyone in this kind of full way about their experiences. Um, and a number of them afterwards actually uh, wrote of their experiences. I think we actually influenced them to do that. Uh, so because it was the first time for these, and because we could ask questions obliquely of the veterans of interviews, these were very intense interviews. So they averaged 4 hours. Some were, they were actually longer, not in one sitting, but longer. Very intense emotional interviews with people talking about things they had not told their partners, had not told other doctors. One doctor in San Francisco who was basically totally burnt out, said to me, it was sort of like off tape, we were getting into a car. I said, do you ever talk to other doctors about the things you've told me? He said, doctors are lone rangers. We don't share these things. And so these interviews could get intimate and quite emotional. Doctors speak about the privilege of being physicians, of having their patients tell them things that they would not tell anyone else. And in a way, we had that privilege in that we had these doctors tell us things that they probably had told very few people, if anyone else. And there were moments when the doctors told us to turn off the tape because basically they had to recompose. As they talked about patients, as they talked about events, they began to weep, they began to tremble, they excused themselves, men and women, but it was a very intense and emotional interchange. And to me, one of the things that was really interesting was, this is not true of other doctors I've interviewed, but doctors are trained to be in control. Even if they don't know what they're doing, they're trained to be in control. And so I thought there would be a difficulty here. And yet, in almost all cases but maybe two, that was not so. It was quite remarkable that once we got into the interview, something happened. And it was almost always uniform, and maybe other people who've done interviews see this too. We would start with certain stock questions. It was just, tell me your date of birth, tell me a little bit about your family and your education, tell me about your training, sort of unoffensive questions. Of course, the tape is going, and they would start talking, and we would have an interchange. And then there came a moment, and I could viscerally feel it, when it's sort of like the interview took off. And my analogy is, when you are lying in bed and you're tired, and you know when you're just about going to fall asleep, and then you remember nothing more. You go over that fall. I just had that feeling. There was a point where, okay, this interview is now taking off. The physician was no longer conscious of the fact that I was Gerald Oppenheimer, that he had not, or she had not met me before, that I had just flown in to Cleveland a few hours ago. We were just sitting in this room, and the person was just having this intense, intimate, controlled conversation. And it was really quite remarkable. So that to me was it was really quite wonderful. And we got an enormous amount of material, quite frank material, very rich material. And I remember sitting, of course, both Ron and I are talkers, so one of the things that we had to learn was to listen. I mean, we're guys, what can we say? But it's so important to learn to listen and just sit there and not only listen to what these people are saying, but what the underlying messages are. And knowing, when they're hinting that they want to tell you more, and then should you probe? Is it ethical to do that? and you try it, and often it works, and there are times when they say, I can't tell you more. But it created a very, very rich dialogue, immensely rich, richer than we ever imagined it would be. And as you're sitting there, these people, and you're having this intense emotional conversation, one of the things that happens is that, with rare exception, you fall in love with the person you're interviewing. I mean, these are really special people anyway. These are people who, when most doctors walked away, committed themselves to, for whatever reason, and which was one of the things we wanted to see, to working with AIDS patients. And of course, people present themselves in the best light. So I think one of the problems we had in writing the book was, here we have these people who have really given us a gift. And they're immensely busy people, taking out time to speak to us for 4 hours, 6 hours, in one case 8 hours, and who were quite lovely and gave us these fantastic interviews, and are just wonderful people. How can you be critical? How do you criticize these people? How do you? We didn't want to write a hagiography. So how can you, at once, how can you be an historian? How can you have that kind of critical, historical posture in this kind of situation? And I'll tell you a little while how we dealt with that. So we interviewed people. These were physicians from all over the country. We eventually interviewed 76 doctors, mainly on the two coasts, but also there's Cleveland, Chicago, Austin, Texas, cities in the Midwest and the South. Some of them we interviewed twice, some of them 3 times. We started our interviews at the end of 1995. We finished our interviews around September 1997. When we started, we really had no idea where this book was going to go, how it was going to end. And we really had no idea about how we were going to use the oral history. When we began in 1995, we were in what one of the physicians called the Middle Ages of the AIDS epidemic. This was in the period, if you know the history of HIV, it was a period where there was deep disappointment with the first antiretroviral, AZT. There was a sense that there was, after 10 years into the epidemic, there were no medications available that could directly and successfully limit the virus. That what doctors had learned painstakingly over those years was how to deal with the opportunistic infections that were secondary to the virus and its destruction of the immune system. The one good piece of news, as I recall, was that there had been a clinical trial, 076, out in California, which had demonstrated that if you gave AZT to women in the 3rd trimester and to the newborn, that you could reduce the mother-to-child transmission of the virus by 2/3, which was impressive. It was one good piece of news in that period. In any case, we had no idea where this book was going and how it was going to end, what the arc of the book would be. We did have themes in our questionnaire, like why did people commit themselves to the epidemic? what was it like to be an AIDS doctor when you couldn't do a great deal, therapeutic impotence. So we had, without going through all the themes, we had themes, and the questions were clustered around these domains or themes. But what happened during the history of this project was that, of course, unbeknownst to us, that by the end of 1996, a new class of drugs would be announced, of antiretrovirals, that in fact were quite effective, and in part because there were a number of them. AZT, it wasn't that it was ineffective, but it was a single drug, and this virus mutated so quickly that viral resistance developed very fast. Whereas if you gave multiple drugs, you could slow down you could slow that down, and then there were other classes of drugs you could give, and so with that, the industry. Pharmacology changed the whole tenor and face and feeling of HIV/AIDS, whereas AIDS was a almost uniformly fatal disease, or once people were diagnosed, they died, depending which period you're talking about, within a year, 2 years, 3 years. AIDS now became a disease that could be managed, and people could live for decades. And they didn't have to be micromanaged the way they had previously. And it dramatically changed the disease, and it dramatically changed the relationship between doctors and patients. A number of doctors retired, they went into different things. They could finally leave AIDS care after almost 20 years, whereas they couldn't do that before because they would be leaving dying patients. And now AIDS was a normal disease. They could move on. So that presented an interesting arc. And in fact, after the interviews, in order to capture that new period, we did a number of interviews by phone with maybe a dozen doctors, and we sent out a survey instrument to get the response of doctors to this whole new regime. And then, what are we going to do with all these tapes, all these transcripts? We didn't know. One thing we knew was we weren't going to use these programs that sociologists use to try to get key terms, and it didn't feel right. As a historian, it just seemed too mechanical. And so we fell back on something very old-fashioned that I've been trained in, and Ron had been trained in, textual analysis. In other words, we read.
And took notes.
And took notes. We read over and over again. And the first time we went through these transcripts, certain themes began to emerge and to arrange themselves. So we said, okay, we started to outline a book. And we said, okay, but how are we going to do this? And we hit upon this very, again, traditional method. We had a sense of what each chapter, what the themes of each chapter would be. So we set up spreadsheets for each chapter. Hard copy spreadsheets. What did we know? And the rows were the physicians, the 76 doctors, and the columns were broad themes. And we went through all the transcripts again, and any time the theme came up, not because there was a key word, but because we could see the thing, we wrote down in the cell, doctor, theme, the pages of the transcript. And that became essentially our guide to the transcripts. And as we worked on this, it became clear to us what the book would look like. That we were privileged to have the voices, powerful, interesting voices of these doctors speaking out about incredible things. And consequently, it seemed to us that while we had a sense of the history of the epidemic, of course, we would not be writing a history of the epidemic. We would be writing a history of the experiences of these doctors faced with a disease of unknown origin. The experience of the doctors, as human beings, living through and living in this epidemic, in which, in the beginning, they didn't know whether they themselves, like doctors that treat tuberculosis or plague years before, might themselves die of the epidemic transmitted by their own patients. Dealing with issues, and these are the chapters, the broad chapters, so I'll go through this rather quickly, dealing with the issues of discovery, that is, there's an epidemic, having your first patients, and commitment. Why did you commit? This to me was a critical question. When people were not committing, why did these doctors commit? And not just for a year. It's easier to commit yourself for a few months. But these were people who committed themselves for a decade or longer. And that's pretty amazing, considering how horrible this disease was and the emotional demands it made on doctors. The second chapter we call the dark years: fear, impotence, and rejection. This was a period during the 1980s, in particular, where doctors didn't know what to do, and basically they were living in a state of fear. The fear was palpable when doctors said that they might get sick, that they had nothing to offer their patients, that in fact some of them were killing their patients, not because they wanted to kill them, but because, as one doctor said, when all you have is a hammer, the whole world is a nail. So if you were an oncologist, what you knew was chemotherapy. People were dying of Kaposi's sarcoma, like cancer, give them chemotherapy, totally destroyed their immune system, they died. And rejection in that their colleagues and their administrators at hospitals were rejecting them. Hospitals all across the country, public hospitals as well as private hospitals. People did not want AIDS patients in those early years, and they didn't want doctors to bring them in. And then the next chapter, therapeutic strivings, therapeutic stumbles, where these doctors are just starting to develop clinical responses and starting to experiment with very toxic drugs that are kill the virus in the test tube and trying to see whether it works in their patients, culminating with the AZT trials. And frankly, when there's nothing else, as one doctor put it, when there's nothing else, clinical trial is treatment too, because it's all there is. And then the fourth chapter we call Travel Agents of Death, and this is what really discusses one of the most powerful parts of the book, I think. I'll talk about this a little bit. And that's the way doctors dealt with death. These were doctors who were trained in the antibiotics era. It's not that they didn't see patients die, but often they were not there when the patients died. They focused on managing chronic disease, but also curing patients. But to have, as one doctor did, 500 of his patients in a closed medical practice die is carnage. Nobody is trained to deal with that, and that becomes very, very powerful. And then the last chapter is called The Waning of the Epidemic, ? Was it really declining? And then the epilogue, which dealt with the story of the protease inhibitors and how doctors were moving on. And so we constructed this narrative where we introduced each of these chapters, set up the issues, and then used the voices of the doctors almost like a conversation in which they discuss the various dimensions of these issues and sub-issues. So that gives a kind of a rich conversation. And it was there, going back to the issue I raised earlier, it was there that we could be critical of our doctors by having other doctors say things that contradicted or that criticized a physician in a very powerful way. And then we could elaborate on that in the text, and that we felt comfortable in doing that. And I don't know how long I've been talking, but
That's great.
okay. What I thought I would do in talking about this AIDS Doctor's book is just give you a little taste of the book, of how we proceeded, looking at the chapter on death and dying. Just giving you some of that. And in the beginning, we did a number of things, and we mentioned the fact, which is critical, that none of these doctors were really trained to deal with death, let alone 500 deaths. We have this wonderful doctor, Lisa Capaldini, out in San Francisco, saying, I remember very early in med school having a sense that something was wrong, insofar as it was clear treatment wasn't working, that we didn't deal with it very upfront. Nor were we, as doctors, very good about comforting our patients and their families. There was just a sort of sense of embarrassment or anger at the patients dying. And there really wasn't a sense of death as part of all our lives, and that treating someone with great care and skill is as important as when someone's in the intensive care unit and getting very technically complex treatment. That at the point of death, you want to do the same sort of thing. And then we have John Mazzullo, again, talking about how they dealt with death and dying and psychologically prepare themselves for it, as well as preparing the patients for it. And John Mazzullo finally said, you can do everything right. Not smoke, run, go to the gym, eat, take your AZT, DDI, or whatever, your cyclovir. Go to every doctor's appointment. Be a goody two-shoes, and you still die. Everybody knows when they come in here that I'm not going to save them. That's not the point of coming to see Dr. Mazzullo. I am not going to save you. We're going to use every tool that Western and Eastern and God knows what medicine has. We're going to do it. But you're still going to die. So that was the message the doctors had to learn and that they had to give to their patients. And so these doctors, in a sense, they went, in order to equip themselves, both in terms of not being able to treat and of having a lot of patients die, they in a sense, went back historically. They said, well, what did doctors do? It was one doctor said, making a biblical reference, he said, there have been doctors around for 5,200 years. We've only been able to treat patients for the last 100 years. What did doctors do the previous 5,100 years? And it was basically holding hands, being there, being warm, giving hope, making people comfortable. And part of that treatment became trying to help people to die, and doctors began to develop this notion of the good death, that These people were dying of a horrible disease, of a stigmatized disease, in a place in the beginning where nurses and other doctors wouldn't even come into their rooms, let alone touch them. And they were going to create a special place, and this death was going to be a meaningful death. And so we have Jerry Friedland, who at that time of this quote was a doctor in the Bronx at Montefiore, working with IV drug users, okay, not even middle-class patients. And he said, we would preside over their cruel deaths. And in a stigmatized, unknown disease, it was quite a trip. But I got very good at organizing people's deaths in this very complicated and painful and unknown situation. You've got to get this person to be at peace with himself or herself and deal with issues of blame and guilt and death and dying. I learned to talk to people about it. I learned to use clergy a lot, something I'd never done in my career. And I learned to work with groups. And then, of course, doctors had to learn how to deal with families, if there were families available, and how to get them to see that the person was dying. There were all kinds of aspects of death and dying that they had to learn. And so one of the things that AIDS did in changing medicine, at least temporarily, was for those doctors who were invested in the epidemic, was to become much more conscious of their role as physicians in the dying process. And some of them actually started working in hospice as a consequence of that. And we have this, I'll just read this these other quotes to you. We have this narrative. This is Joseph O'Neill, who at that time was a medical student at San Francisco General Hospital, since gone on to become a very famous AIDS doctor. And he talks about an early patient of his. He was very sick. He was wasted. He was paraplegic and in just awful pain. He was a gay man living in San Francisco. His parents lived in Florida. They came out in total denial of what was going on. They loved this guy, their son, passionately. And all they wanted to do was to fix everything. And they wanted the best doctors, everything that money could buy. And what does Dr. Volberding say about this? Dr. Volberding being one of the great AIDS doctors. And what does so-and-so think? I mean, very kind of controlling behavior. Or like, he wanted chocolate pudding and they sent him peach pudding. I'm going to call the head of the hospital. They were very hard to deal with. You can imagine, these are real nudniks. And here I am, this medical student, working with a resident who wasn't even paying much attention to the patient because he was no longer an interesting case. He was dying. And the patient was very much the same way, like his parents. You know, this room is too bright. I asked for water and I didn't get ice, and I wanted ice. So he's a kind of Jewish prince. And meanwhile, here's a skinny, dying young man who's worried about the flavor of his pudding. You know, I mean, the whole thing was wrong. I remember this. This is where I really learned something about doctoring from him. One morning, I was just talking with him and sort of listening. And he looked at me and he said, am I going to die? And I said, yes, you're going to die. And he said, when? And I said, very soon. And he asked, do my parents know about this? And I said, I think they do, but you have to talk to them about it. And he said, no, I couldn't talk to them about it. It's too hard. And I said, when your parents get here today, you have the nurse page me, and I'll come. And about an hour later, we were rounding, and I got paged by the nurse saying that the parents were there. I came back down, I walked in the room, and they were just doing all this stuff, and the whole time I had never seen one of his parents touch him or lay hands on him in the 3 weeks they were there. I mean, they did everything but. They were running around, they were fixing the blinds. I remember they were fixing the blinds in this room, and I went out and I brought in chairs, these folding chairs. And I set up the chairs around the bed, and I said, stop it. I mean, it was just me, no nurse, no one else, just me, this little medical student, you know? And I said, sit down. We have something very important to discuss here. And so they sat down. And I said, what we have to discuss is the fact that your son is dying. And I said, I just want you to talk about it. So I'll leave the room if you want, but this is what's happening. There's nothing more we're going to do. Your son is dying, and you really need to spend some time with him. And I remember his parents, they started crying. And they got up and they held him, and in 3 weeks they had never touched him. And I left. And I said, you have to say goodbye. It doesn't matter what he's eating. It matters that you spend some time together. And I was called that night, maybe 2 hours after they left. He died. So I'll end with that. And this is why, yes, they're just powerful, powerful discussions like that. And you can see why we used the voices of the doctors to the force of that to narrate the book. So I'll talk a little bit about the next book, just to touch on it. We thought we were done. You know, Ron and I have been working the AIDS epidemic for 18 years. Like the doctors of the book, we thought we'd go on to do something else. And then in the year 2000, there was the international AIDS meetings, which occur every 2 years, took place for the first time in Africa. And they were in Durban, in South Africa. And that was the meeting where people outside Africa became aware of the depth of the epidemic on that continent. That whereas San Francisco and New York, to us, looking inside our country, were the epicenter of the epidemic, in fact, the epicenter had shifted outside of the West, and was now in sub-Saharan Africa, where about 75% of the cases occurred, and the epicenter of that was South Africa. And we were stunned to learn that at that time, in 2000, about 5 to 6 million people in South Africa, with a population of about, 46 million people, were HIV positive. And as we learned one of our first trips, we took 4 trips to South Africa, there were parts of one province called KwaZulu-Natal, which is where Durban is, which had the highest rates of infection. That there were prenatal clinics where 40% or to 50% of the women visiting the prenatal clinics who were HIV positive. Imagine that. It was stunning that something under half the women in these areas were already HIV positive. And of course, when you hear something like that, you want to do something. And in fact, some of the doctors, like Jerry Friedland, who I quoted, were already in Africa. They had left the United States, but they started working in African countries where the epidemic felt like the epidemic in the 1980s in the Bronx. So what could Ron and I do? You wouldn't want us treating patients. We're historians and ethicists, so we decided we were going to come out of retirement, as it were. We had been retired for about 4 days, and we were going to become witnesses, as we had of this American epidemic. We were going to become witnesses of the epidemic in South Africa. This was a time when the New York Times did not have correspondents in South Africa. People were not interested in Africa. And we thought we had to get the word out of what was happening in South Africa. So we began a new project. And the outcome of that new project is this second book called Shattered Dreams, an oral history of the South African AIDS epidemic. The title comes from a speech by a man named Chris Hani, who, if he had lived, if he had not been assassinated by the South African police, probably would have become the second president of South Africa after Mandela, because he was so popular. He was charismatic. He was the leader of the military wing of the African National Congress, the leading Liberation Party, and he was General Secretary of the Communist Party of South Africa. And the liberation movement was essentially, had three legs. It was the African National Congress, of which Mandela was the titular head, the Communist Party, which supported them since the 1940s and 50s, and the trade union movement in South Africa. And these are basically the ruling groups today. So Chris Hani, at a meeting in Mobutu in 1990, meeting which was set up to deal with the health issues that they would have to deal with when they took over South Africa, said, "We have a noble task ahead of us, reconstruction of our country. We cannot afford to allow the AIDS epidemic to ruin the realization of our dreams." So he understood that the AIDS epidemic, this is in 1990, represented an incipient threat to South Africa. And but nobody did anything. And so by the time Mandela is elected in 1994, there's already an enormous epidemic in South Africa, where, I mean, no one knows the numbers. It's not a reportable disease in South Africa, but you say 4 million, 5 million people were HIV positive, enormous number of people. So you could say that the AIDS epidemic, in part, was one of the consequences of the apartheid regime that was then carried over into the new dispensation under Mandela. So one of the things that we tried to do in this book, of course, is to describe through doctors and nurses. We really did the same thing as before. We interviewed doctors from all over South Africa, every racial group, every specialty, same as it did in the United States. Almost all the geographic areas, urban, town, mine, countryside doctors, to get their experience of the HIV/AIDS epidemic there. So through these doctors, trying to get a sense of what it means to have 5 or 6 million people infected. But this book also is a very political book. The AIDS Doctor's book, in a sense, is an eternal history of the AIDS epidemic as experienced by physicians, which is not to say there aren't political issues or ethical issues as part of their practice. But there have been other books written about the politics of AIDS. In South Africa, first of all, we're writing for an American audience that doesn't know about the politics of South Africa. Second, you're talking about an epidemic which came out of the apartheid era. This has to be a book about politics and about, as it turns out, about ethics. And in addition to describing the force of the epidemic and its effect on the healthcare system, I think what this book is is a book about inequity and inequality. The first book, I think, is a book about commitment. To me, it's like writing a book about the resistance in the Second World War. Why did some people in 1940 become resistance people? And what was their experience of the next 5 years with their life in danger? Here, this is a book about inequity and inequality on multiple levels. There's domestic inequality, along with AIDS. The new dispensation under Mandela also inherited a two-tier medical system. There's a private sector and a public sector. I'll say about the private sector, you could be sitting in a hospital in the private sector, and you could be in a hospital in Cleveland. You could be in a hospital in Rochester, New York. You wouldn't know you were in South Africa. The private sector is one thing, and you can get the same medical care, the same drugs as you could get in the United States, but you have to have the money or health insurance that covers that. The public sector is where the majority of the population is treated, and that has been traditionally underfunded. Of course, under apartheid, the funding was channeled on the basis of race. So the best hospitals, like Gruta Skura, which was a world-class hospital like Bellevue, was for whites, and then there were lesser hospitals for Indians, and the worst hospitals for Africans, and the urban hospitals were better than the rural hospitals. But essentially, the public hospitals are where the poor, which is to say the majority of people with AIDS, who are by and large Black Africans, were treated. And you're pretty aware outside of Gruta Skura that you're in a third world medical system. And so this is a system that people went to when they started coming down with AIDS, and very quickly these hospitals began filling up, and just as quickly they had to keep people out, because if they took all the people in, their wards would be inundated. Their wards would be like the wards were years ago. And I have this, if I can find it, this sort of vignette by Henry Sunpath, who was an Indian doctor in a ex-missionary hospital in Durban. And he talks about his first experiences of AIDS. And he was working in an ex-Indian hospital, or maybe it still was an Indian hospital in Durban. And he said people used to be coming in stretchers from all over the outlying areas of Durban, absolutely sick, dehydrated, vomiting, hardly able to breathe. And their entire communities used to be coming along with them, saying, please, please help this person, do something. And there was no mechanism in that hospital to take these patients in, to sort them out medically, to equip them with knowledge, or the means to go back home and take care of themselves. The hospital was so overwhelmed with the number of these patients that at the emergency level itself, the basic minimum was done, and they were asked to go back home. It was devastating. I used to go back home and tell my wife, I just don't know what to do. That showed me the extent to which I really needed to get involved, because it was just so hopeless. Looking at the faces of these people near death, and just looking, and they were just looking at you to do something. So these are public hospitals. They just cannot take these patients. They're just too many. So this states very starkly the difference between the haves and the have-nots. Those who had money or had health insurance had access to antiretrovirals, where our previous book ends. By 2000, if you lived in the United States, certainly if you lived in the UK and had HIV, you had access to antiretrovirals. In South Africa, you had access to antiretrovirals only if you get to the private hospitals. And as one doctor said, you know, if you're a rich man, you can buy a Mercedes. If you're a poor man, you can buy a pair of shoes. With AIDS, if you're a rich man, you live. And if you're a poor man, you die. It was that stark. But then there were other issues of inequality that this raised, which people would just start to think about. And that is, why is it that we accept the fact that there are not antiretrovirals in developing countries? Something we just took for granted. Why do Western countries, or the pharmaceutical companies, which are primarily or Western, price their drugs in such a way that they don't make them available to developing countries? Is this equitable? Is this fair? Should people in the developing world just die because they were benighted and unfortunate to be born in poor countries? So that raised a lot of very important issues in the late 1990s, including in South Africa, where the drug companies were trying to prevent the government from importing antiretrovirals cheaply from India or buying them through other countries, middlemen. And then a third issue occurred in South Africa. And this is before 2000. At the meeting in Durban, in addition to learning about the burden of the epidemic, the scientists there signed a petition against the stance of the president of South Africa, people, not the virus, and that all we were doing by using antiretrovirals was enriching the first world pharmaceutical companies who probably were responsible for propagating this idea that a virus caused the disease. And so Mbeki refused to allow antiretrovirals into the public sector. Again, the private sector, anything you want. Perhaps the antiretrovirals were too expensive in the late 1990s. But by 2000, the price was coming down substantially. And in fact, some of the drug companies were actually offering South Africa some of the drugs like nevirapine for free. And still, the government rejected their offers. And so in certain ways, clearly this exacerbated the inequality, because only people who could access the private sector somehow could get drugs. And so it's this whole theme of inequality that plays out in this book, and how physicians in South Africa, many of whom had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement, were members of the African National Congress, had to deal with working within the public sector, had to deal with the inequalities and the rationing of the public sector, accommodate themselves to that. Accommodate themselves not only to the fact that most of their colleagues did not want to touch an AIDS patient, but that they still believed that there was nothing you could do. In the year 2000, 2001, we actually, that there was nothing you could do for AIDS patients, which was nonsense. And you just let them die. And then how do you deal with your government, which you supported? Everyone voted for Mandela, when they take this stance. And how do you create islands of resistance? How did these doctors over the early 2000s do what the treatment action campaign wanted, what ACT UP used to say, get drugs into bodies. And this is the story in this book until there is a kind of denouement, of course, the one that we could not know. And that was in 2003, and Mbeki stepped back and finally allowed his government to begin planning the rollout of retrovirals to the population, which was done at a glacial pace because his Minister of Health did not believe in antiretrovirals and was instead advocating the African potato, garlic, and olive oil as nostrums for treating HIV. So that when we ended the book in 2006, the rollout was occurring, but at this glacial pace, where people essentially were treating the patients they knew, but knew out there, outside their clinics, there were millions of people who were not being treated. So that there was this kind of optimism, yes, we can do something, but this kind of pessimism that what we're doing is kind of a drop in the ocean. And I've spoke too long, I'm going to end right there. And thank you for your attention, and take questions.
Thank you so much.